We're back. The Battle of Gettysburg kind of just got started. I'm not going to talk much. Video.
Ultimately broke the Union Army by early afternoon, who retreated in chaos, jamming up the streets. Lee gave his most unclear order to his newest corps commander, Ewell, as he was instructed to take Cemetery Ridge if practicable. Ewell, being indecisive, did not believe he would be able to take Cemetery Ridge with his men and decided to rest them for the remainder of the day. The Union was now organizing on Culp's Hill, Cemetery Hill, and Cemetery Ridge, all of which would be important to win the battle.
I just want to say, when I went to Gettysburg, this is really the area that I visited, and the Round Top and all that. You can't fathom just how big this is. I mean, this little distance right here, it's a mile. That's a mile. This whole fishhook is massive. Massive. And then the eventual cemetery where Lincoln gave the speech is somewhere over here. But it's just, it's so big you can't comprehend it, even when you're there. I gave myself several hours to walk it, and really all I did was just this area here. I mean, you need days, because there's battles on the other side of Gettysburg, all through Gettysburg. You need so much more time. So if you're interested in it, don't do what I did. Actually give yourself time. I went there just for a day, kind of soaked in as much as I could, but I need to go back.
At night, Longstreet implored Lee to rethink his strategy, head south and position themselves between Meade and Washington, D.C., and wait for the Union to attack them on their own terms. Lee was determined to break the Union Army, forgetting everything he had learned while at West Point, and more specifically, his lessons he learned by reading from Napoleon.
On the 2nd of July, Lee focused the attacks on the wing of the Union Army, which had formed a fishhook to allow for fast deployment of troops where they were needed. The eager and arrogant Corps Commander, Daniel Sickles, disobeyed orders and broke from the Union line, occupying the Sherfy's Peach Orchard, forcing Meade to desperately fill in the gaps. Longstreet sent Hood's 4th Division to attack Sickles' position, while Hill threatened the center, and Ewell was tasked with taking Cemetery Hill. Longstreet's attack was successful, as Sickles was overrun from his position. Fierce fighting continued around Little Round Top, which was protected by the 20th Maine, because if Little Round Top fell, the whole Union Army could have been rolled from its flank. Meanwhile, on the right flank, Ewell started his attack in the evening and easily overwhelmed portions of Cemetery Ridge, yet Union reinforcements were able to push them back.
On the third day of the battle, Lee believed that the Union center was weak, which in theory should have been correct, but he was wrong, as Meade had reinforced his corps, guessing Lee would initiate his attack in the center. Lee had been effectively beaten already at Gettysburg, and yet made the questionable decision to attack Meade's center. In March of 1863, Lee suffered a medical episode. The exact diagnosis was unknown, but it was cardiac-related. This medical event potentially caused Lee to make the controversial decision to charge Meade's center using Pickett's division, now known as Pickett's Charge.
Now, remember when I told you that that span was a mile? George Gordon Meade guessed that they were going to be attacking. They were going to be attacking at that point, at the center, that Union fishhook. They were going to be attacking right there. He guessed it, so he put reinforcements there. The Confederates, when I tell you it's a mile at a slight uphill. So the whole time you're running with all of your stuff on, which I don't know what they had to carry back then, but still you're carrying weapons. You're running 1 mile at a slight incline. And you're running over you know, ground with some rocks in it and all kinds of stuff. And you know, the Union waited for them to get close enough and then opened fire with the cannons, and they put that buckshot in there and stuff like that, where it was basically just, I mean, it's a cannon, but it's like point blank range. Okay, now point blank. Imagine being 3 foot away from somebody with a shotgun pointed at you. It's not going to be pretty what happens to you. That's pretty much what was happening to them. As they all got in close enough, they let those cannons explode. It was just blood mists just floating in the air. And they said after a while, people were fighting, and it was just plumes of just blood just misting all around, and people are just walking through it and just getting blood all over them. It was brutal. It was absolutely brutal.
Pickett's division would have to march over 1 mile of open ground to reach the Union line, exposed to
Open ground, that was another thing.
both Union artillery and then rifles at short range. Lee started with a grand artillery barrage to soften the Union center, which failed to respond to the attacks. Believing the barrage had worked, when in fact the Confederate artillery had overshot the Union line, Pickett's charge proceeded as planned. Only when the Confederates came out of the woods and were at the point of no return did the Union artillery open fire. Those Confederates who made it to the Union line were either killed or captured, completely shattering Pickett's division. Lee's defeat at Gettysburg broke the Army of Northern Virginia, and they retreated back to Virginia, having lost more than
I just got to say this. I went to Hollywood Cemetery in Virginia, and George Pickett's buried there, Pickett's charge. Now, you'll never find me sentimental for the Confederate cause. But when I was at his grave, I did tell him, because every time I go to graves, I always talk to the grave. Thank him for letting me visiting, stuff like that. You know, just be respectful, regardless who you're there. I same thing for Jefferson Davis. You know, I didn't agree with what he did, but, you know, he's paid. He's gone. His punishment, you know, he paid for his sins. So, but when I was there for Pickett, I just remember saying, I felt bad for him because of the loss of life for his men, which he didn't anticipate. When Lee gave that order, I believe it was it Longstreet that had to tell him to, you know, muster up your men and go. And Longstreet knew it was a suicide mission, and he couldn't even bring himself to tell Pickett. Pickett was like, "Are we doing this? What are we doing?" And he just nodded a yes. He couldn't tell him no, but he refused to tell him yes. And so, you know, when I was at Pickett's grave, I was just like, you lost your entire division, and that wasn't your fault. Because later on, a comment gets made from Lee to Pickett saying, you know, "General, where's your army? Form your army." And he's just looking around. He's like, "I have no army," because he just watched them all get slaughtered. And that's probably one of the times for the Confederacy where I truly feel bad for those guys, even though they're on the opposite side. But those guys had a job to do, and they ran through, and they were oblivious to the fact that so many saw this is not the right thing, and yet they were led through like cattle at a slaughter. And, you know, it was kind of sad. The Fredericksburg thing, if anybody has any interest, look up the Angel of Fredericksburg. And it's was he 18, 19-year-old kid that was on that battlefield after the first day of fighting. People were moaning out on the field. He's a Confederate soldier, jumps over with the canteen. He runs all over the field giving people water. Union soldiers were aiming in on him. They were going to shoot him, and they decided against it once they saw what he was doing. So they were tossing their canteens on the field. He's running around just giving people water, throwing canteens back over. He finally got down. I don't remember how long he did it, but he gave as many people water as he could before he just became exhausted. Went back to his side, jumped over, and he just broke down crying. And I don't remember what his name is now. You know, an extremely good-hearted person in a terrible situation. But that young man, I think he died before he was 21. I think he was 20. He could have been 21. He died at the Battle of Chickamauga. And I bring that up now just because I'm thinking of sad things. But that's another thing that, you know, his actions should be talked about, whether they were Confederate or Union. His actions were that of brave and sympathy and, you know, just a very caring kid who unfortunately didn't get to live very long.
Third of his army in the three-day battle, in which half alone were killed in Pickett's charge. Lee would not engage with the Union Army again until the 4th of May, 1864, in the Battle of the Wilderness, where he faced off against General Ulysses S. Grant. Longstreet would be wounded by his own troops and be out of action for 6 months, while Lee and Grant bloodied each other in consistent counterattacks against one another. Lee personally led from the front until his men forced him to the rear by guiding his horse away from the battle. Lee would pull back to Spotsylvania and prepare for Grant's first assault on the 7th of May, leading to a nearly 2-week-long battle as Grant tried to navigate around Lee. Grant would lead a doomed assault on Cold Harbor in June. Despite having the numerical advantage against Lee, he would follow up this failure with the 9-month-long siege of Petersburg.
I've always been curious if anyone's ever seen the History Channel's Grant. It's a 3-part episode. It's fantastic. You know, miniseries about Grant's life. It's fantastic. Whoever plays Grant, I don't think I've ever been more willing to say that guy fits it. He just fits the role. But there's a part in there where Grant and Lee just had a battle, and the second in command, whoever it was for Lee, comes up to him and says, "Hey sir, it looks like Grant's pulling back, you know." And the Lee, I have so many names. Lee says, "Do you know anything about Grant? Do you know anything?" And the guy's like, "No." He goes, "Okay. Well, if you did, you would know Grant's not leaving. You know, he's not running." And I've always wondered what went through even the soldier's mind. Because Lee would win, and McClellan would leave. Lee would win, and Hooker would leave. Lee would win, Burnside would leave, you know, whatever. I always wonder what the mindset was when they found somebody who didn't leave. You know, they would run into him again. There he is. He's hitting us again. He's attacking us again. What the mindset is that goes against soldiers who are used to having a leader they rely on, they trust in Robert E. Lee. Him always seeming to win to them, but now he's facing somebody who doesn't care who Robert E. Lee is, doesn't care how many victories he had. And I always think that the first thing that would go in those situations is the bravery of the soldiers. And once that bravery turns to questioning, you know, not questioning Lee, questioning this monster that doesn't care who Lee is and who just keeps coming. And you know, you can see why a lot of people started fleeing, but I always wondered what their initial thought was, like, oh my gosh, he's still here. It'd be a great thing to try to find, you know, maybe reading diaries of surviving diaries of soldiers, and just to see what that mindset is when they realize, oh, this guy, he ain't running. He's continually attacking us. Sorry.
June of 1864 to April of 1865, when he finally took the city, forcing Lee to retreat. Lee was no longer able to protect Richmond, which fell on the 3rd of April 1865. Grant pursued Lee with the help of General Sheridan and divisional leader George Custer, cutting off retreats and attacking supply wagons relentlessly. The hounding by the Union forces became too much for the beleaguered Army of Northern Virginia, and on the 9th of April 1865, Lee surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The terms were much more generous than Lee had imagined, as the side arms of officers, private horses, and baggage were protected from seizure, and each officer and man were allowed to return home on parole, so long as they observed their parole terms. Lee spent the next few days overseeing the disarming and disbanding of the army until the 12th of April, when he left for Richmond. The Civil War would officially end on the 13th of May, 1865. After the Civil War, Lee lived a relatively quiet life, accepting a president's position at Washington College. Lee would be harassed by the Northern press throughout his time at Washington College for, quote, bringing up rebels, despite Lee trying to remove himself from the resentment many Southerners felt from losing the war, even scolding Jefferson Davis and Jubal Early for their aggressive outbursts after the war. Lee did lose his citizenship and right to vote as a result of his part in the Civil War, but these would be ultimately restored under President Johnson's second amnesty for Confederate veterans on the 25th of December, 1868. On the 28th of September, 1870, Lee was following his normal workday before attending a church meeting and then coming home for supper. Mrs. Lee poured him a cup of tea, and as he spoke to say grace, nothing came out of his mouth. Lee had had a stroke, and after 2 weeks, Robert E. Lee passed away on the 12th of October, 1870 at 10 a.m. Robert E. Lee holds a unique place in American history. He has been described as, quote, a Caesar without his ambition, a Frederick without his tyranny, a Napoleon without his selfishness, and a Washington without his reward. While Lee's view on race is abhorrent in today's light, we must judge him by the era he lived in, and the question remains.
Thank you. That's something I always say. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Would Lee be received better today if he had stayed in the Union cavalry?
Yes.
Lee is often romanticized in the aftermath of his death as part of the lost cause narrative, the belief that the South fought for a righteous cause. Lee himself would have vehemently disagreed that the South cause was just, as he opposed the construction of statues of Confederate icons following the war, believing it would...
I always thought that was very commendable. I don't have a problem with Confederate statues on a battlefield. I don't like Confederate statues in the center of town somewhere. I understand, you know, we're paying homage to great. And, you know, when Germany does that with Hitler, do you think people are going to be like, oh, no, it's fine? You know, of course they wouldn't. You know, if there was a Pol Pot statue or, I want to say Stalin, but there probably is. I have no idea. But it just, statues, Confederate statues, I don't have a problem at battlefields, because you could say, okay, Robert E. Lee statue here, this is where his headquarters were for this one. I get that. I just disagree with the statues in everyday life where people would have to see them. Now, what does that mean for Union statues? They won. Union statues, sure. If you want to put them on battlefields, I get it. But the history is written by the winners, you know?
Prevent the healing of the nation. Lee was a man filled with the potential for greatness, yet his fault at the critical moment was choosing to side with what he felt was right for himself, as many did in the Civil War. Robert E. Lee historian Elizabeth Pryor is brilliant in her analysis of Lee and asserts that, quote, "We want him to be great because he has elements of greatness in him. But he falls short because greatness must rest on two pillars. For Lee to be considered great, he must, quote, create something that not only benefits the world each day, but endures and embodies a far-sightedness that reaches beyond the complacency of one's narrow experience. Lee even admits the immorality of slavery, but does not act against the institution he knows is morally wrong. And while after the war he called for unity, he resisted change that would ultimately better the world." What do you think of Robert?
I will say this about Robert E. Lee. He was asked to be the first for the Klan, the first Grand Wizard, and he passed. He didn't pass because it was a terrible thing. He passed because he said the organization needs someone younger to be a part of it. And then he recommended a couple people, Nathan Bedford Forrest being one of them, who did get it.
E. Lee, was he wrong to fight for the Confederacy and in doing so support states built on slavery? Or was he an honorable man who defended his home of Virginia to the last and remains arguably America's greatest military commander of all time?
Completely disagree on that one. He's not even top 10. Sorry. He gets a lot of love for the Civil War love aspect and all this and that. I mean, I think Joe Johnston was a better general than him.
Please let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
I'm going to go ahead and end it there, and we're just going to take it as a Lee and then Grant, even though they're combined. I was really hoping they'd intersplice it, do Lee a little bit and then Grant, and kind of build them up until finally their stories merged. But, you know, hey, I wouldn't edit it like that, so, because I'm lazy. Okay, end it here. It is, in case anybody cares, when this airs in about a month, it's like 38-17 now. 49ers are up. So, that's pretty much a game. My nose is itching. Okay. So, like and subscribe. Otherwise, I'm not going to stop the video. Did you like and subscribe yet? Okay. Trying to call my bluff, I see. God damn, I'm thirsty. Can you hurry up? Because I want to get a drink. Seriously, stop playing these games. I want to get a beverage. Alright, you win.